Todos bem?
Hello.
Sejam bem-vindos novamente de volta ao Teatros, depois de um breve, pequenininho, mas importante intervalo, né? Luciana Ximenes, eu e a Isa não aguentamos de saudades e resolvemos retornar às atividades do Teatros e, ao invés de deixarmos para começar no ano de 2025, como rezam os bons protocolos, nos antecipamos de modo pretensioso, criativo, como nós somos, e vamos começar a nova temporada do Teatros em pleno dezembro, com todos já cansados, exaustos, mas estamos aqui novamente. Sejam todos bem-vindos. Espero que possa ser novamente um belo momento de trocas, conversas, eh, interlocuções, debates. Sejam todos bem-vindos. E nós vamos reinaugurar o Teatros convidando novamente um grande amigo nosso, o analista Giorgio Tricarico. Jorge já esteve aqui conosco ano passado, ou 2024 ou 2023, eu não me lembro, aonde ele veio apresentar esse outro livro dele, As Deusas Esquecidas e um caleidoscópio sobre pornografia. Foi um encontro muito instigante, muito interessante, nos deixou ótimas impressões, detalhes, ideias. Isso nos fez tê-lo em boa lembrança. E o Giorgio acabou de lançar um outro livro, Vozes Contemporâneas sobre a Individuação, o legado de Jung para o mundo moderno. Ele é editor desse livro, é um livro que contém vários artigos sobre a questão da individuação, com alguns autores que já estiveram aqui no Teatro, como o nosso querido amigo brasileiro Marco Heleno Barreto, o Mark Wimborg, e, e quis a nossa sorte que essa será a primeira vez que o Giorgio vai apresentar o livro dele publicamente. Então, nós somos agraciados por sermos a primeira plateia a receber o Giorgio falando sobre esse livro dele. Eu vou apresentá-lo formalmente. O Giorgio, ele é psicólogo, psicoterapeuta e analista junguiano, morando e trabalhando em Helsinki, na Finlândia. Ele é membro da IAP e um dos fundadores do Grupo de Psicologia Analítica da Finlândia-Estônia, onde atua como palestrante, supervisor e presidente. Ele trabalha com pacientes adultos desde 98, realiza palestras internacionais sobre questões relevantes em psicologia analítica, escreve artigos e tem livros publicados pela Reuters. O Labirinto de Possibilidades, Deusas Perdidas, um caleidoscópio sobre pornografia, e esse mais recente, Vozes Contemporâneas sobre Individuação. Jorge, meu amigo, sempre bom revê-lo. Fico feliz de você estar aqui conosco, de você ter aceito o convite. São 9 horas da noite aí em Helsinki. Eu sei que está tarde, numa sexta-feira, no fim de ano, mas muito alegre por você ter aceito a nossa proposta, pela tua disponibilidade. O livro, como eu te disse, eu estou lendo, estou gostando muito. É um livro muito importante. Acho que ele vai gerar boas conversas, boas discussões. Queria agradecer a tua disponibilidade. Por favor, a palavra é sua. Seja bem-vindo novamente ao Teatros.
Thank you very much. Obrigado to this wonderful presentation. I saw in the messages that I can say boa tarde or something like this to everyone. I am very grateful to Luciana and Marcos for this invitation, and to Isa as a translator of this seminar. As Marcos said, this is the first time I'm going to share some of these contents of this new book, and I'm really happy that I'm doing it with you, because I think the Asos is a very valuable group. So I am very honored to have the chance to speak again to you all. I don't remember, well, it's 9:30 in Finland now. Oi, what's happening here? Yeah, now I see only Marcus. Let's see if I can see I prefer to see the people, yes. Okay, I would like to know the schedule from Marcos before starting. It's 9:30 here.
Eu também não sei, acho que...
So how long would you like me to introduce, and how long would you like to have space for discussion? Just this question, then I start.
Giorgio, fica à vontade, você fale o tempo que você achar necessário. A gente pode ter uma meia hora de discussão em torno disso, mas fique completamente à vontade, tá?
Ok.
Leve em conta o seu horário, por favor.
Yeah, no problem. I will go to bed late tonight. There's no problem. So let's start with.
Giorgio, 1 minute, please.
Yeah, please.
Pessoal, tem uma tela. Tá, vamos lá. Desculpa, Giorgio.
It's not me, and yeah, somebody was. I also. No.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's start with something about the idea of this book. It's many years I was reflecting on the topic of individuation in postmodern time, because I think that what I read about individuation in my training and then in my first years of work was always referring to Jung's time or maybe some post-Jungian theories. It seemed to me that they were a bit, let's say, outdated as contents. I was reflecting sometimes, how is it individuation in the current time? Is it the same thing as the time of Jung or 100 years ago, or has it changed something? This was the starting point many years ago. And even if individuation is a very central topic in Jung's theory, because basically it is the scaffolding of all the theory of Jung, if you go in Amazon or in other big online bookshelves, so to say, and you check the first 100 books in the Jungian books section, it's really rare to find any book with the word individuation in its title. Most of the, let's say, the most sold Jungian books, they are often, Jung's original work, and many times they are works about archetypes, they are works about typology, but individuation is very seldom represented. And after Jung's death, actually, not many post-Jungians have dedicated works to individuation. Basically, after Jung's death and before year 2000, there were maybe 4 or 5 major works about individuation. A couple by von Franz, Individuation in the Fairy Tales, and few others authors have dedicated some time to this topic. Now, after the year 2000, some more books are popping up, retrieving the topic of individuation, but most of all, they do that illustrating mostly Jung's take on it. So I was wondering, could we say something about individuation in our era? Has it changed? So first of all, let's agree on Jung's definition and on the main definitions about it. And then I will give you a series of questions that were popping up in my mind. According to Murray Stein, who wrote a book about individuation It's called the principle of individuation. Individuation is defined as an innate tendency to incarnate itself fully. Keep in mind, innate tendency. So to become truly itself within the empirical world of time and space. Again, Stein is adding something like individuation pushes consciousness beyond where the normal development brings it. And it's basically a way of going beyond genetics, the society that we live in, and the rules we have incorporated during our first half of life. It's an innate tendency to go beyond all this. Basically, Murray Stein's definition is resonating very much with Jung's definition in the collected work at the end of the book about psychological types. Jung says in that book, the definition is that individuation is the process by which individual beings are formed and differentiated. It is the development of the psychological individual distinct from the general collective psychology. So individuation, still Jung is talking, is a process of differentiation, having the goal of the individual personality. So just to summarize all these definitions, individuation, first of all, occurs according to time and space. And individuation in the 15th century is not the same thing as individuation nowadays. Individuation in Brazil maybe is not the same thing as individuation in, I don't know, India or Japan. Because it is in relation with time, with space, with the physical place, with the geographical place, with the culture, with what we can call the zeitgeist of the period, with the specific culture and the subcultures that are within a culture. You know that in Jung's opinion, in the beginning, we have to form an ego and reach a certain degree of adaptation. So we have to reach maybe the ability to work, to have a profession, to marry, to have a family. And then in the second half of life, according to Jung, the principle of individuation would kick in and would start questioning the values and the norms that we have absorbed during the first part of life. When this principle is activated, so to say, we question collective norms and values. We start questioning our persona, which is the social mask that we have developed in order to be acceptable to ourselves and to others. And we start to get in touch with unconscious contents. First of all, according to Jung, the personal shadow. I think you know all these things, but I'm just starting with this just to set the starting point, Jung's definition. Stein, in his book, says that individuation is a process involving two movements. The first movement is called the analytic movement, or separatio in alchemical terms. A movement of disidentification from roles, models, rules, habits, cultural norms, religious objects, and traditional practices. So the analytic movement, analysis, lysis, is like dissolving, is a disidentification from all these things. These things are all connected with the outer reality, so rules, models, religions, cultural norms, and etc. There is also in this phase the need to differentiate from internal, archetypal, unconscious contents. I'm telling the definition of Stein because I have kind of a difficult view on archetypes. I very much rely on work by Warren Coleman, which is titled Act and Image. It's a very interesting book about how to think of archetypes maybe nowadays, between parentheses. So the first movement, the analytical movement, disidentification with all these things. The second movement, according to Moore-Stein, is a synthetic one, conjunctio in our chemical terminology, where a prospective orientation of the psyche suggests new directions beyond the persona identities and beyond the repetition of collective models in reality or archetypal. So basically, this second phase, a synthetic one, there is a synthesis of different elements in our psyche coming all together in a more coherent and harmonic complex of elements. This prospective teleological new direction from the unconscious would manifest itself, for example, through symptoms, through dreams, through fantasies, and through numerous experiences like synchronicities or things like this. And the direction that this teleological force shows would go towards a totality, a wholeness. As I said before, Jung was envisioning a first part of life in which we reach adaptation, and a second part of life where individuation kicks in. I believe that nowadays it's very difficult to think of such schematic theory, because when there are some traumas, when there are some difficult situations, when suffering kicks in, probably individuation and questioning a lot of things start also in the first part of life. It depends on the journey of every person, let's say. According to Sonu Shamdasani, the historian of analytical psychology and editor of the Red Book and the Black Books, the Red Book itself is basically depicting Jung's individuation process. His own personal process was meeting these figures, having a dialogue with these unconscious elements, evoking even these figures and these fantasies in order to have conversation with them. So on one hand, the Red Book shows how Jung's individuation process was unfolding, but also he tried to extract from that a kind of general schema that could be valid, let's say, for everyone. Everyone has its own journey, but the goal would be anyway to achieve psychic completeness. The individual, non-divisible. This is the etymological meaning. In order to do this, we would need a good enough developed ego in order to deal with these unconscious contents. And Jung's ego is very present in the Red Book. It's the element of dialogues with all these figures. It stays solid. It's not swept away by these meetings with unconscious contents. And Moore-Stein reminds us also that Jung's idea of individuation has also a religious flavor, because Jung thought that it's a way of transforming God's image. Stein is summarizing it with Jung's experience was a way also to help Christian tradition to individuate, allowing God to become aware of itself through its creatures. Okay, all this boring because probably you know all this stuff already, is just to set the definition of individuation that you will find in Jung's work, in other Jungian works. Are you happy with all these definitions? Has everything been said about individuation? I don't think so. There's a lot of questions that we can ask ourselves about this topic. First of all, first question. Now I make a list of questions. You can find this list also in the introduction to this book that Marcus was showing you. So, first questions. If you agree that the ego is absolutely rooted in the collective culture and in the zeitgeist of a period, because the ego emerges from the relational field of one's own personal history and the people that we are dealing with, the epochal changes that have happened during the last 3 centuries, at least in the Western world, if we want to call it like that, has changed a lot the zeitgeist that was present in previous eras. Like in my book on porn, I rely very much on the work of Günther Anders, which was a German philosopher that I especially like. In Günther Anders' opinion, the current zeitgeist is that technology has become the subject of history, and human beings are just co-historical. It's a very strong position, and I cannot tell you why Günther Anders arrives to this conclusion here. But anyway, there has been a very big shift in the last 300 years after the Industrial Revolution, and especially in the end of the 19th century, when Nietzsche was claiming that God was dead and all the values had lost value. Nietzsche was basically detecting this big change that was in the zeitgeist. God as a concept was not anymore necessary. It's much more central in the current society, technology and economics, than God, for example. So basically, an ego born in our period probably is a different ego from an ego from previous eras. And if the individuation process requires an ego that interacts with unconscious contents, but also with the collective norms and rules, if we change the ego, maybe also the meaning of individuation changes. So are we dealing with the same process that Jung had in mind? As analysts, do we all have in mind the same idea about individuation, or do we have different ideas about it, about the goals? And this was the second question. So the first question is, the ego has changed. How does this affect individuation process? The second question was, is it still the same process that Jung was dealing with, or updating with the new current era and the new zeitgeist and the different egos of nowadays? Are we dealing with the same process, or has it the same goal? Third questions. Can individuation still be intended in religious terms, like Jung was saying? In the epoch after the death of God, can we really think that somebody is helping some God to incarnate or to become aware of something in an epoch where God on a collective level is dead? Then on an individual level, a person can be perfectly religious, can believe in some God, that's okay. But how do we put together this individual level where I can be religious with a collective level where religion has not anymore any central space? Fourth questions. Already saying that individuation has this, let's say, religious flavor of helping God to become aware of itself. Isn't this a sign that the concept of individuation in Jung is very much rooted in Western, Anglo-Eurocentric, Christian, white, colonial, classist and elitist perspective? the idea of a God becoming aware of itself is valid only in monotheistic religion. What about Hinduism, or I don't know, whatever other religious approach? Already in this, we can see that Jung had obviously a very Eurocentric perspective on individuation. A bit provocatively, I'm saying in the end of my introduction that, in my opinion, this is my personal opinion, of course, individuation today, how many people can do like Jung, being in some place and talk with Philemon, with evoking these fantasies, when you are maybe, I don't know, in a poor neighborhood, in some difficult environmental situation, in a war scenario. I mean, already thinking of individuation as me talking with some unconscious element, doesn't it sound a bit of a privilege compared to the situation of many human beings? So we have to wonder something about this Western colonial white and privileged perspective on individuation, I think. Fifth question, shouldn't we talk about co-individuation instead? Because also the idea of individuation has a very strong accent on the individual. And this is also a very Western element. Isolate individual self-development is very different to think of individuation as a relational process where we are not alone. And Jung was saying this, that always individuation had a relational element. But here I'm underlining relational in reference to other human beings with a more sense of a community, which is less Western and more non-Western perspective, the idea of communities. The relationship with the environment, with all the living beings, with planet Earth that we are unawarely or terribly destroying, for example. So shouldn't we think more of co-individuation, where co means together, togetherness? Sixth question. What happens if we consider the birth of the ego as the first step of a process of individuation? Because Jung was not considering this. In the Jungian theory, it was Fordham who introduced this idea that individuation is active from the very start, and it has something to do even with the birth of the ego. I will say something more later about it. But if we include the birth of the ego as a first step, how does the process of individuation change? Could we still consider it an innate psychological imperative later in life, as the definition of Murestein was intending before? Because actually, if we don't develop a strong enough ego, what level of individuation we can reach? So the development of the ego is a big factor influencing what kind of individuative steps we can do. So not including it or including it changes the perspective on what is individuation. Seventh question, what is the role of love in the process of individuation? This is something I never read anywhere in Jungian and post-Jungian literature. Does love has any role in the individuation process? Love is always a very controversial topic, by the way. It's difficult to define. We will try to think about it very soon. Then, another question is, can we think of a collective individuation throughout history? Meaning that not only an individual goes through some individuative passages and reaches maybe more developed or integrated psychic landscape. But can we think also of individuation as a historical, on the historical collective level? Can we see history as a process where there are moments of changes that are somehow bringing individuation level of humanity further? Thinking of the current war situations that we are experiencing here in Europe or in Middle East, it's hard to believe that there is an individuative direction in the human beings, because it seems that we are still very, very primitive in the same old psychological mechanism of the scapegoat, like René Girard has beautifully illustrated. So maybe it's questionable, but we can think of it. For example, I was thinking, for example, that for many centuries the world has been male dominated. Feminism from the end of the 1700s in Europe, with the work of Mary Wollstonecraft, and then during the 18th and 19th century, and especially the 20th century, feminism has been a kind of element that was counteracting the one-sidedness of male-dominated patriarchal societies. So feminism, for me, has been an element of individuation on the collective level, because it was potentially questioning the norms and the values of centuries before. And then, shouldn't we include also the topic of death and mortality in the horizon of individuation? Because there's a lot of psychotherapeutic theories and schools of thought that they try, during the therapy, they try to cope with traumas, going through crises, containing symptoms, reaching some degree of well-being, but they very rarely address the topic of mortality in therapy, unless the patient brings it, of course. But it seems that in a lot of therapeutic methods, the point is well-being. But individuation, and so personal growth, spiritual development, whatever we want to call it, shouldn't it include the end? Because it's very much an element that is usually repressed, also in psychoanalytical work. So I have listed some 10 questions, which in my opinion should be addressed, and we should not stop just at Jung's definition of individuation. We should address a little bit these topics. Basically, the idea of this book came out because my own reflections on these questions and other questions came to some proposals, came to some ideas about individuation. But I'm very aware that individuation is such a complex topic that one single voice is not enough to describe it and to contain it. So I started looking for other people to write from different angles on individuation. And the result is this book, where every chapter has been written by some different analyst or scholar. Some of these 10 questions are addressed by some of them here and there. And tonight I have too short time, of course, to summarize the contents of everybody else. But I can tell you that, I mean, I'm not advertising the book, because I have learned already that with such books, I will never become rich. So don't worry, I'm not earning anything probably on it. But if you are interested in the topic, I would really warmly recommend you to read yourself. What have different authors written about individuation? I have a personal proposal, of course, in my introduction, which I just mentioned here very briefly. I was putting my accent on the fact that if individuation is questioning norms and values, opening to some other elements of ourselves. In the current times, what are the dominating values and norms? Capitalism, technocracy, which is the domination of technology, economic liberalism. These are the main ones. In my opinion, individuation nowadays should absolutely address also these topics. So my proposal in the introduction is pretty strong, because there is the idea that individuation would be very important in the current times. Otherwise, also collectively, we can be totally swept away by these collective norms that are dominating our work. So I kind of believe that individuation today is not anymore just conversating with some unconscious images, but it has to be embodying this antagonist attitude to the dominating rules of our time. I don't think I'm a revolutionary here. I just want to make it clear. I'm very interested in etymology. Maybe you remember who listened to my porn lecture. Revolution has a very sad etymology. Revolvere in Latin means to rotate on an axis. So basically the revolution is like the planet revolution. They turn, they come to the same point of the start. And we have witnessed many revolutions that were trying to change something, and then the situation was exactly as before or even worse. In my opinion, it's not a revolution what we should aim at, but transformation, which means a change of form, transform. And individuation, in my opinion, today has also the flavor of trying to transform something in ourselves and outside ourselves, also in connection with these dominating rules. Anyway, every chapter is touching some of the questions that I was touching before. The first one, which Marcus has just read, is a conversation with Sonu Shamdasani. And I would like to underline this. It's really a conversation. It's not an interview. Shamdasani, of course, I thought that he could have been interesting in the book because he is the bringer of what Jung said. Basically, Shamdasani has spent more time in Jung's archive than in his home, almost, I would say. And he is very expert of every detail that Jung put not only in the collective work, but also in a lot of unpublished material. So for me, it was very interesting to involve him in the project because he could say something about Jung's take on individuation. But it's not an interview because I'm not just asking him things. Many times I'm promoting my own view on individuation, and he disagrees with me, and I disagree with him. So it's really an interesting conversation from this point of view. It's not at all just a light summary of what Jung said, but it's kind of a. I was trying to put some of these questions to him. For example, he doesn't think that there is a collective individuation in history, and he says that Jung doesn't think that too. I still think of it as a possible perspective on individuation. And so that conversation is already interesting because Shamdasani's ideas are very much and beautifully summarizing all that is important about individuation in Jung's idea. We spent a whole day. I went to London. We spent a whole day together. I was recording every now and then our conversation. I had many hours, and a lot of things that he was saying was, hey, this is not going in the book, please. And so we were kind of gossiping all the time, mostly. But then I selected only the interesting part for the rest of the readers, let's say. Then there are chapters which are talking about clinical cases, and they reflect on individuation in connection with clinical processes. Because this is a very important point here. Mark Wimborne, in his chapter, for example, is underlining this point. There is an idea of individuation as reaching totality, the goal of this individual, non-individual, and this is what Wimborne calls a kind of romantic ideal of individuation. But then in the reality of our clinical practice, we find small little steps that are very important steps of transformation of a person. And he says that this should also be considered individuation, not only this ideal. In Jung's writing, there is a lot of this ideal position on individuation. He's interpreting dreams with mythological motives, dragons and stuff like that. Usually they were the dreams of Wolfgang Pauli, Nobel Prize in Physics. But my own patients never dream such things. Some people don't dream at all, for example, in my practice. And so what do we do there? Nothing individuative. I believe that we do something individuated, but we have to change the perspective from this grandiose plan to some smaller steps in the clinical journey. And Wimborne is not the only one who talks about individual cases, shedding some light on the steps of an individual personal life that should be put in connection with individuation. Other chapters are dealing with synchronicities, for example, as interesting events that are opening a door for questioning something. Then it depends on what kind of response the ego does to these synchronicistical events. Actually, synchronicistical events can have a meaning if there is an ego observing it as meaningful, because if the ego doesn't even see it as meaningful, nothing happens out of it. There's a couple of interesting chapters about what are today called identity politics, gender issues. One chapter is from a Latin American colleague. She has worked on the topic of lesbianism and individuation, like the process of acknowledging, for example, a lesbian identity, gender identity, as an individuative process, confrontation with norms and values that one have absorbed, confrontation with the culture and subculture they are immersed in, and the process to get to a point where you feel more yourself than in the beginning. So it's a very interesting trajectory through the example of lesbianism. But then there was another colleague, the chapter after, which is reflecting on how identity politics, gender politics, they can become also some ready-made dresses for having some sort of identity and for solving some existential troubles. And maybe then once you get to that label, you stop from working from other stuff on an individuative level. So one chapter was shedding a light on how acquiring awareness of a different gender identity is an individuative process. Another chapter is wondering how this assuming an identity, is it promoting further individuation processes, or does it stop them? Because then you stick to an identity without questioning anything else. That's also, I think, a very interesting topic after all. Your Brazilian colleague, Marco Heleno Barreto, which I pronounce bad, has included temporality and mortality in the process of individuation. His chapter is a bit more philosophical, but it's a very interesting topic also to add. And I think he did an excellent work in order to carry some difficult material in a readable way, because it's readable. And as far as I'm concerned, and maybe this is the last part of my presentation today, which I hope will leave you with a lot of curiosity, so that you can look yourself for the contents. My contribution to this book has been two things. In the introduction, I was listing all the questions that I shared with you. And then I made my proposal of how individuation is really to question the collective norm of the period. But then there is another chapter, which is, I believe that nobody has still written anything about it in the Jungian literature, is a reflection on individuation and polyamory. Or basically individuation and non-monogamous relationships. And if we have a little time, I'll give you some hints of the chapter, but I can tell you that the chapter is much richer than what I can tell now, of course. Just to show you, let's say, the connections that I made, and if you will be curious of this, you can deepen yourself the topic. I was starting with this, with one of my questions, like the fact that individuation is always, whatever definition we have in mind, whatever idea we have in mind of individuation, I think on this we can all agree, it's a relational process. It's about relationships. Also, Jung underlines this in his work, The Psychology of the Transference, for example. He's pointing out that there is always the need of a you, with the capital Y, which means the you could be an external person, yes, but also unconscious contents, elements that are not the ego. So there is always a you, there is always a counterpart for individuation. So the relational aspect of individuation is already evident in Jung's idea of a dialogue with unconscious material, between the ego and unconscious material. There is a dialogue. Where there is a dialogue, there is a relationship. This unconscious element can be met directly, so to speak, for example, in dreams or in fantasies, or also indirectly, when we project these elements into somebody else in the relationship. We can recognize, if we recognize that it's our projection, we can recognize some elements of our unconscious put in somebody else. But then there is also the relational aspect of individuation is also regarding real encounters with real people out there, with ideas, with cultural artifacts, also with people who are not maybe directly met. You can have a relationship with an author, with a writer that you never met in your life, but reading that book spoke to your soul. I really mean like novels. I'm not thinking of theoretical work. So all these elements, all these encounters, may they be internal or external, they are a moment of potential individuation, because we can get in touch with our own unconscious material through all these relational processes. So individuation is not a monadic process that occurs in the void. I set myself on a peak of a mountain and I meditate. That's not necessarily individuated. We can do that, and we can meet some other contents outside our ego also there in isolation. But anyway, we need a you. And as I said before, we need a strong enough ego to go further with these meetings, because if the ego is not strong enough, these encounters can sweep it away, can invade it, can fragment it, and we can start defensively to protect the ego from this encounter, and we stop there any process. So here I wanted to mention this idea that I strongly maintain. In my opinion, the birth of the ego should be considered the first step of individuation. As I said before, Jung did not agree at all with this, Shamdasani also, because Jung was saying that, sorry, I hear some voice. No, I heard somebody entering, sorry. Yeah, I was saying that Jung was not agreeing with the idea that the ego is the first step. He was claiming that individuation starts when you have reached a good degree of adaptation. So after that. But Fordham instead was telling that the self was active since birth and was promoting with this activity of integration and deintegration. I don't know if you're familiar with the Fordham theory, but anyway, there was an active element in this process of integration or deintegration of the self that is promoting the birth of the ego. And in Fordham's opinion, that's already the self in action. So it's already an individuative process. I think that Fordham is right and Jung is not, because I would underline this. In Jung's idea of individuation, there is a paradox. On one hand, the individuation is considered by Jung a natural necessity, an inner imperative, but at the same time, it's a goal for the very few. Only few people can individuate. And this is a paradox. How is it possible that it's an inner imperative and only few can individuate in Jung's idea? So Jung's view on individuation doesn't explain this paradox. Fordham's view on individuation makes this paradox more understandable. Because if individuation starts with the birth of an ego, if the ego, through the vicissitudes of the relationship with caregivers and the initial steps, is not a strong enough ego, of course, will access to a certain level of individuation. So including the birth of the ego in individuation explains why individuation is a natural imperative to develop, but not everyone reaches a certain level because the ego is part of it. And if the ego is damaged, so to say, the range of individuative passage will be different. A question that I was posing, so if we agree that individuation starts with the birth of the ego, then it becomes very important the phase of the development of the ego with the caregivers. Winnicott, Bion, and many other psychoanalytical authors have written a lot about the importance of reverie, of holding, of mirroring back to the child what he's feeling. Also, in some Jungian authors, there has been some deepening of the initial phase of the birth of the ego. For example, Verena Kast, which I think Chiasos have invited also in the past, because you're really great in this. She was underlining how the ego, in Jung's idea, is born as like when the child in the beginning is unconscious, the basement of the ego is the body. And the body has needs, of course, to eat, to be contained. And the caregivers are very important in holding and mirroring back to the child containing the needs of the child, giving positive feedback to the child, so that the child feels the right to exist. This is how Verena Cast defines it. So the need of this empathetic validation of the experience of the child. If this is part of the process of how the ego is born, we can say that then love has a role in individuation. But what is love? And here we could spend some hours because love is very seldom a topic in academic books, because of course there is the idea that love is not definable. Maybe poets can define it, can hint at it, but not a scientific approach. But with this vague definition of love, then it becomes very difficult to understand what is the kind of role that love can have in the individuation, in the birth of the ego, especially in the beginning. So I was trying to look for a definition of love that can be useful in this concern. We have to have a definition if we want to speak about the role of love in individuation. So we have to agree on a definition. And I found a very interesting definition of love in the work of a Black feminist author called Bell Hooks. She has written a book called All About Love. It's a very interesting book. And in my opinion, the definition of love is a very important definition in our reflection on individuation. First of all, she defines love not as an inner feeling, what we feel inside, but as an action, what you do for the other person. This is very important, a very important starting point, because if love is defined as not what I feel inside, but what I do for the other, love and abuse cannot coexist. If we think that I love so much this person, so I hold this person at home, I close her at home because I don't want her to be in danger, and I want to keep her only for myself. I claim to love the person because I concentrate on my inner feelings, but my action is locking this person, which is an abuse. So if I define love as my inner feeling, I can abuse of the other person with no problem. But if love is an action, and what kind of action? This is Bell Hooks' definition. Is an action that we choose to do in order to nurture the other's growth as well as our growth. So basically, it's an action that I choose to do in order for the other person to grow or myself to grow at the same time. With this definition, love and abuse cannot coexist, because love is something that I do for let's say, empowering the growth of the other. Whatever I do differently, which is actually limiting the other, is not love. That's it. Unfortunately, according to Bell Hooks, many people have learned as children that love and abuse can coexist, or even worse, that abuse is a form of love. What I like very much in this definition is that it's a definition that sets a clear idea of what kind of love we should think of when we speak about individuation. They are action aimed at the other's spiritual development, Hooks call it. But we can translate it as actions aimed at the other's psychological growth or individuation. And at the same time, at my own, because if we only dedicate ourselves to the other but not to ourselves, well, we are not loving ourselves. So it's more, what we do is less love and more a strange sense of sacrifice that in previous eras were very much praised, but I would doubt that it's the love that we should care of. The development of the ego needs this love not necessarily. Hooks differentiates this specific kind of love from other things like care, respect, what else? Support, nourishment. All these things are other things. But this specific love is actions in order for the other to grow. Is a very specific thing. It can be present or also not present. The ego will develop anyway, but it will develop in a different way. Because, you know, the ego is made of many things: memory, perceptions, unconscious elements, sensations, all the functions that Jung has taught us, and blah, blah, blah. So all these things will develop. A structure of an ego will develop even without this kind of love, but with some limitations. Then in my chapter, I dedicate a big part to reflect on couple relationship as a place for mutual transformations. I go through the idea of how a couple starts, usually with a kind of symbiosis, with a phase of mutual projections. Then there is the moment of the withdrawal of the projections. And then if we go on, we can reach a certain level, which I call the mutual loving gaze, which is exactly this kind of love that Bell Hooks is talking about. This is a very complex part. I won't summarize it here, but I just want to tell you what are the steps. So, birth of the ego, what is love, Bell Hooks definition, how this works with couple relationships. And then we get to non-monogamous couple relationships. This is also a very complex chapter that I invite you to read because I cannot summarize it. But anyway, the whole going through the couple phases, symbiosis, projections, and then withdrawal of the projections and so on, is very much based on a couple. And this is a very interesting reflection. We always think of this exchange with the idea that it's the exchange of two people. When we include more than two people, when we go in the territory of non-monogamous relationships, usually in psychoanalytical work, there is immediately a pathologizing attitude to these settings. And this is because we are immersed in transparent water, which we can call mononormativity. Basically, what is mononormativity? It's all the rituals, the customs, the narratives, the practices that claim, that establish that monogamous couple is the only legitimate, morally right structure for emotional and sexual intimate relationships. So basically, the assumption is that all the real relationships are monogamous, and everyone will eventually settle down in a monogamous relationship in the end, when they become adult. So mononormativity is the thought that the monogamous relationship is the natural form of relationship, and we should all aim at that. Usually, when we speak of monogamous relationship, the adjectives around it are committed, responsible, serious, mature, real. These are the adjectives defining a monogamous relationship. Such adjectives, they imply a moral superiority of monogamous in comparison to any other form. Mononormativity is constantly repeated in movies, fairy tales, stories, novels, scripts, songs, psychological theories as well. And they repeat over and over that monogamous coupling is the most desirable goal and the morally right way to reach happiness and a good life. In an article of mine, I was that I re-expanded in this book, I was already showing some biases that psychoanalysts have when patients bring in the topic of non-monogamous relationships. And I don't have the time now to tell you what are these biases, but believe me that we are, as analysts, very much unconsciously dominated by a mononormative perspective on relationships. And we tend to consider everything else as pathological, not mature enough, problem of commitments, and a lot of other stuff. I talk about these biases in my book, and then I go instead to show more in details what is polyamory, what is the ethos of polyamory, which has nothing to do with this lack of commitment and a lot of other biases, but it's a very interesting field of potentially transformative passages, exactly like the monogamous couple. Actually, to borrow a sentence by Warren Coleman again, he was talking about marriage. Marriage can either promote or restrict psychic development. We all know it. There are people that when they are together, they marry or they couple, just they become less than what they were before when they were single. There can be couple containers that are actually restricting psychological development because the couple relationship becomes the theater of complexes and patterns that are reenacted from the past. They can last years and years, even if they are terrible couples. So a marriage can promote instead individuative passages, like I call them, or restrict them. This can be said also about non-monogamous relationships. They can promote or restrict psychological development exactly like the monogamous. There is no difference. There is only one difference between the two containers, the monogamous containers or the non-monogamous containers. Retrieving Bell Hook's definition of love. In monogamous container, I can support the other personal growth until the point where the other's growth threatens my need to be unique and my attachment styles. In the non-monogamous relationship, instead, this limit is not posed. I can support the other's development even if it threatens my uniqueness. Because in the non-monogamous relationship, to be unique doesn't mean to be the only one. Actually, this is a very interesting topic about non-monogamy. When you ask, it happens with some patients which have this arrangement in my practice. When you are in a monogamous relationship and somebody asks you, what is the let's say, what is the basement, the base of this relationship? And many people tell you, well, we have kids, we have a house, we have common finances, yes, and this thing. But basically, the basement is actually the emotional and sexual exclusivity. In non-monogamous relationship, there is no emotional and no sexual exclusivity. In that moment, you can wonder yourself, okay, then why am I with this person? What is the basement of this relationship? The answers that you can find in these arrangements are very interesting. And it's very interesting that when you take away the emotional and the sexual exclusivity for monogamous couple, they don't know why they are together if you take away those two pillars. I'm ready to receive a lot of insults in the end of this. Anyway, the last part of the book, of the chapter, after having illustrated non-monogamy as a valid container for individuative passages, I go to Jung's personal experience, because the Red Book, which is supposedly the individuative process of Jung, was born as an experience within a frame of a non-monogamous relationship between Jung, Emma Jung, his wife, and Tony Wolff. So even if it was a kind of defective container, because Jung didn't practice ethical non-monogamy like today we would call it, there was not a mutual agreement. Emma and Tony, to what we know, did not have other partners themselves if they wanted. I don't know if Jung ever accepted or not, but the ethical idea of a non-monogamy is that everybody involved agrees on the arrangement. Emma and Tony Wolff had to accept that Jung had two partners. So this was not an ethical agreement in a way. Nevertheless, the complexity of this triangle, I think, is very entwined with the experience of the Red Book, with the experience of Jung's individuation, and with the experience of Emma's and Tony's individuation. So basically, it was a relational field, very charged and very problematic, that brought about a lot of transformative passages for the three of them. And the last part of the chapter is about how basically individuation is born as a concept, even in Jung, out of a non-monogamous arrangement. So basically, this is the perspective of my own chapter, which I believe has never been written in the Jungian literature from this perspective. I'm not saying this to show off anything. It's just that, in my opinion, to speak about individuation should include really a lot of different dimensions, and to some extent, the concept itself of individuation, the concept of relationships as an individuative field, the concept of non-monogamous relationship, and the concept of love, according to Bell Hooks' definition, are all part of the field from which individuation as a concept was born. Okay, I think I flooded you with, in a very short time, with a lot of stuff. Probably not having enough time brings what I said to be a bit dogmatic, or without proofs. There's the need of more time, of course, in order to delve into the details of each passage. For example, in what I was saying about non-monogamy and individuation. But I hope, as a general result, that this presentation is giving you something to think about, because I think the most important thing is your own reflection coming out of every stimuli that you can receive when somebody's talking. So I was not here, and the book is not there to say the ultimate truth on individuation, but to put on the table topics. And the most important thing is how the encounter of these topics with you will generate maybe some other things. So I really do hope that this is the result. And I stop here.
Obrigado, Giorgio. Ótimo a apresentação. Acho que a gente tem um tempinho aí razoável para a gente conversar. Você usa uma expressão na introdução do seu livro que é uma polifonia de perspectivas, né? E acho que ler o teu livro sobre esse ângulo é muito rico,
Yes.
porque não há nenhuma intenção de fechamento, de conclusão. São aberturas, né? Novos sentidos possíveis para esse conceito. Acho que isso ajuda muito o exercício do pensamento. Jorge, queria fazer duas perguntas.
Yes.
Vamos lá.
Yes.
Inevitavelmente, não há como negar que a gente vive uma cultura narcísica, uma cultura da performance, da visibilidade, uma cultura da produtividade, uma cultura do mostrar-se para o outro, né? Ainda que nós saibamos que esses sujeitos narcísicos se reúnem sempre em torno de um ideal. A beleza, o belo corpo, a performance sexual, a produtividade no trabalho. Há alguma coisa homogênea nisso. A minha pergunta é: poderia algo da individuação, como proposto por Jung, nesse sentido de uma singularidade, funcionar como um antídoto dentro da cultura do narcisismo? Pode a individuação ter um efeito antinarcísico? Faz sentido essa pergunta para você? Ela... Há espaço para a individuação numa cultura saturada de ideais narcísicos?
Yes, I think this is a very important question about individuation. It seems to me that the basic ingredients of the ego are very much rooted in power, will to power, possession, domination of the weak, destructivity in order to gain an identity. So all these elements are, seems to me, very entwined with the real structure of the ego from the very start, and have a correspondent element in the outer world, because capitalistic, technological, economical world in which we live, basically they embody the same idea. There is the power over others, the destruction of the weak. This narcissistic idea that you summarized with this word, it seems to me very much connected with this. In my opinion, individuation should be, should be subverting this approach. It's a subversive element. Unfortunately, capitalism is so strong and so pervasive that even individuation can become a commodity that can be sold, a retreat for meditating and individuate yourself. Everything can be taken into this approach where the center of everything is only you, your own well-being, and whatever. And if we are doing, let's say, something in that direction, we are not subverting these external collective values and norms, which are the same values and norms that are forming the ego from the very start. So I believe that, yes, individuation should be, like you called it, an antidote to the narcissistic mindset of the world. It's very difficult to act like that, but I believe that this is why I hope that this idea of individuation circulates also beyond Jungians. Because for us, it's a jargon word. We know what Jung means. But for non-Jungians, I mean, from other schools of thoughts, it should be important to start thinking of this as a central element of psychological development. Thank you for the question.
Perfeito, perfeito. Vamos, pessoal, a gente está abrindo para as perguntas. Quem quiser fazer, coloca o nome no chat. Eu chamo, tá? Luciana, vamos? Tá por aí, Lu?
Giorgio.
Isa, give me 1 second. Give me 1 second because the battery of this iPad is getting low. I need to connect it to the. You can speak and I will hear, but you don't see me. I will do something. I mean that who wants to make a question can already make a question because I hear.
Eu percebi que ao longo da apresentação ele continua usando a palavra, o termo, né, processo de individuação. Apesar de eu ter percebido também nas múltiplas perguntas que ele fez na introdução dele, ele está aí, né? Estou falando para ele.
Ele tá
As
aqui,
múltiplas, as múltiplas perguntas que você fez na sua introdução, que existe realmente uma pluralidade de individuações, que não existe um processo de individuação. É, e isso é um pouco o que o Hillman traz, né? O termo individuações, e não o termo processo de individuação, que é essa coisa rumo ao self e tal. Então, isso é uma coisa que eu queria que você comentasse. A história do processo de individuação, se faz sentido ainda usar esse termo, ou se a gente usaria o termo individuações. E a outra coisa que eu também, que é um termo do Hillman, que para mim me faz muito sentido, é que ele fala que o que individua é o daimon. E daimon também é uma palavra que não aparece muito aí no seu discurso. E para mim faz sentido, né? Isso de descobrir o daimon, os daimons, e a individuação ser uma jornada para essa descoberta, né? Para essa revelação. Essa é uma pergunta que eu queria fazer.
Thank you very much for the question. I am also done, almost done, because I had to go in another room to collect what was missing. Sorry, but I don't think you see me. Wait. Okay, now I'm here.
Agora já.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Luciana, for this question. Well, about the idea of individuation and process of individuation, we can, of course, question what kind of word we would like to use. I underline the word process because there is the idea of a direction in the word process. Procedere in Latin means like to walk forward. So process is like walking forward. I also use very many times in the book, when it's my parts, of course, individuative passages, which is something that in English is not very correct. There is not the word individuative, but maybe in Portuguese, in Brazilian, it can work as well as in Italian. I underline individuative passages, moments of passage from one thing to another form, for example. So this is why I prefer to use process or passages, because they're all words that are telling of a movement in a direction. First thing, and but of course, if you want to get rid of the process and just talk about individuation, I guess you mean the same thing anyway. So it's just a matter of the vocabulary that we choose, if I understand well. Then you mentioned the daimon and Hillman. Well, I don't know what Hillman has in mind with the idea of a daimon here. I tend not to use images that are formally archetypal and elements like this. But if we want to use daimon as an inner element that drives in a certain direction, we can also use the Greek word telos, like the goal, the end. And I think that we are in the same territory of what Hillman was saying. Individuation is a process driven by something that is not the ego in general, at least in the beginning. But when the ego decides to open to what emerges, there is also the decision of the ego to walk together in a direction with this daimon that has popped up, so to say. So I always see it as a cooperation with another element. And we can use that word if you like it, if that's your own vocabulary. I'm perfectly fine with it. I don't see it any difference. Thank
Legal,
you.
Lu. Eliana, querida, contigo, minha amiga. Eliana,
Eliana.
cadê ela? Microfone fechado, Eliana.
Sim,
Ok.
sim, sorry.
She appeared in the
Entrou,
outside.
ótimo, desculpa. Estou aqui absorta. Então, o que eu estava dizendo é que você e a Luciana já apontaram um pouco, porque não são propriamente perguntas, são mais comentários, né? Você estava falando desse nosso espírito de época, né? Que foge do negativo, narcisista, que nega a morte, que busca viver apenas na gratificação, né? Na evitação do desconforto, do sofrimento. Se a individuação é egodistônica por natureza, né? Eu não vejo como essa individuação seria para todos. Não vejo como. Então, eu gostaria que ele falasse um pouco isso, né? Sobre isso. Como ser para todos uma individuação numa cultura onde nós vivemos buscando a felicidade da fusão na psique coletiva das redes sociais, né? Primeira coisa, tem uma coisa de um ego que acaba sendo conduzido aos processos, né? De egos que são produzidos aos processos, e alguns que literalmente negam, dizem não quero, né? Quero voltar para o meu lugar de conforto e proteção. Esse é um primeiro comentário. O segundo comentário que tem a ver com o que a Luciana falou, né? Quando ela trouxe o daimon, é a questão do luminoso, que para o Jung é muito importante. Ele diz que a aproximação do luminoso é que promove a cura ou a melhora, ou seja lá o que for, né? E quando ele fala, o Tricarico fala das religiões, né? Se faz sentido depois que Nietzsche declarou que Deus está morto, e a gente sabe que Nietzsche não declara que Deus está morto, ele declara que aquele Deus, né? Que aquela maneira de compreender Deus, que aqueles dogmas estão mortas, né? Não a ideia de Deus, né? Jung fala sobre um instinto espiritual, né? Quando ele remete ao luminoso, ele está falando de um instinto espiritual, quer dizer, de um movimento inato do ser humano para isso, independentemente, aliás, ele diferencia muito a questão do espiritual dos credos, das confissões, né? Então, eu acho que a individuação, independentemente de qualquer confissão ou credo, ela tem essa aproximação ao luminoso que a Luciana apontou como sendo esse desenvolver do daimon, da imagem, né, da imagem essencial do que o James Hillman fala. E acho que nesse sentido o Jung aponta a possibilidade de uma religião para cada indivíduo, assim como uma individuação para cada indivíduo. Cada ser humano tem o seu processo. Cada ser humano tem o seu encontro com o luminoso e com o instinto espiritual. Então, são comentários, não são questões, mas está aqui.
Thank you, Eliana, for these comments, and all my envy for you being outside in a warm environment.
It's hot here. Thank you.
Which is very different here. I thank you for your comments. And about the first one, what I would just add is that it's absolutely true that most of the people, they look for the comfort zone, and we are surrounded by a lot of things that are against any individuation, but actually it's very good if we are just consumers of commodities and that's it. But like in the conversation with Shamdasani, we were talking about, sometimes the starting point of an individuative process starts with suffering. And even if the ego wants to deny all this and goes into just a kind of hedonistic, narcissistic life and social network and whatever. If suffering kicks in, usually the whole castle crumbles down, and then maybe the people are forced to do something else. Of course, if there is no suffering, probably nobody wants to start an individuating process. But suffering, unfortunately or luckily, I don't know, kicks in. Thank you for the other comment on luminosity, which is very important, very interesting. It would open up a lot of other big topics. You had Gigerich, I think, in Chiasos to lecture. Probably you know that Gigerich thinks that Jung was not accepting a big passage in the history of humanity. God was dead, and Jung tried to recreate a God within, calling it the self, and didn't change anything. Before God was out there, and now God is the self within. Gigerich is against this and says that Jung didn't want to accept that actually we are in another phase of life as a humanity.
Tem essa experiência de individuação do Jung, né? E ele disse, né? Não me sigam, não venham atrás de mim. O meu caminho é o meu caminho. Talvez a gente precise mesmo encontrar os nossos caminhos, né? De individuação.
Yeah.
E não são o dele.
Definitely, yes. It's true. Yes, it's important to underline that also. But I was mentioning Gigerich just to say that there can be different idea of what is luminosity after the death of God, but it's a big. We leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eliana.
Obrigado, Eliana. Giorgio, temos tempo para 3 perguntas? Pode ser?
Absolutely, no problem.
Então vamos lá. Martinha, querida, contigo.
Boa tarde. Obrigado, Giorgio, pela palestra, foi ótima. E o que eu queria falar é porque, assim, nas coincidências, né, você falou, né, sobre qual o papel do amor, né, na individuação, e falou que o amor é uma ação para outra pessoa. E tem quer dizer, já falecido, né, mas o Carlos Bernardi, um psicólogo aqui que trabalhou muito, né, com junguiano, com Hillman, e ele fez uma tese de doutorado em 2004, em que ele fala exatamente isso, a questão, eu não sei como é que vai ficar aí a tradução, né, mas é que ele está falando de transformar o processo de individuação para o processo de individuação, donation, né? Porque dizendo que a relação do ego, né, com as figuras do inconsciente, assim como pessoas e figuras também do mundo externo, né, teria que ter, o ego teria que acolher o pensamento do outro, o outro com letra maiúscula, né, num gesto ético por excelência de abrir mão de sua posição para deixar o outro se apresentar. Então, é isso que ele chama de a questão da ética e do processo de individuação. Eu achei muito interessante, né? Eu estou até fazendo aqui talvez a gente vai lançar essa tese, né? Mas eu achei muito interessante, até mesmo 2024, você falar, porque eu acho que tem tudo a ver com o que você falou, essa questão do amor, esse respeito ao outro. Então, eu fiquei bastante, assim, inclusive emocionada aqui. Muito obrigada. Não sei se ficou claro aí na tradução, né? Muito obrigada.
Thank you, Marta. Very interesting. I hope that maybe in the future there will be a translation, so that I can see what are the points of, let's say, of contact between these two ideas. Thank you.
Obrigado, Martinha, querida. Camila, contigo.
Boa tarde, pessoal. Todo mundo me escuta?
Sim.
Sim, maravilha. Boa tarde,
Yes,
Jorge.
yes.
Obrigada pela tua apresentação também. Acho que foi bacana a Marta ter feito a colocação dela antes, porque eu vou mais ou menos pegar aí um gancho com ela, né? Porque ela refresca para a gente que tu trouxe sobre amor como ação da Bell Hooks, né? Tua inspiração aí, tua companheira de pesquisa, né? Ah, eu estava aqui conversando, na verdade, nos bastidores com a colega que está aqui com a gente, a Laura Peçanha, porque ela tem uma pesquisa, né, e ela vai muito ao encontro do que tu foi trazendo, assim, na tua colocação, né, então, claro que, pelo menos para mim, está pendente a leitura do livro, né, porque eu não iniciei a leitura ainda, mas, e aí, com essa pendência, eu que quero te perguntar se quando tu traz, né, esse diálogo que tu faz com a Bell Hooks, do amor como ação, né, e tu faz essa relação com o amor e o abuso, né? O amor como ação não faz possível, né, com que haja uma coexistência com o abuso, né? Se você faz essa relação com relações monogâmicas ou não monogâmicas, se você segue algum tipo de fio na tua escrita, eu não sei se eu te entendi bem, né? Se essa relação está em capítulos diferentes, por exemplo, né? Então, eu gostaria de saber se tem algum fio nesse sentido, né? Se você relaciona de alguma forma, quando você diz do amor como ação, não poder coexistir com o abuso, né? Quando você traz as vivências monogâmicas e não monogâmicas. Não sei se deu para entender, eu espero que sim.
Thank you, Isa. Some words here and there were missing from your translation because of the line, but I hope I understood the question. Yes, what I illustrated was all in one chapter. It's in the chapter of individuation and polyamory. So there is all that I said in the second part of the presentation today is from that chapter, which is my chapter. I think obviously that I should have talked about what I have written and not what other authors have written, because maybe you can invite again Wimborne or others to talk about their parts. But I wanted to speak about what I wrote first of all. And yeah, I try to put all in chain, like individuation is a relational process. Love is important in relationships, in the birth of the ego. I took Bell Hooks' definition of love. Then I try to see how this concept of love is present in the couple relationships. And then I extended the view on the non-monogamous relationships also. And I ended the chapter reminding how Jung, Tony Wolff, and Emma Jung had a non-monogamic relationship also, from which individuation topic came out. And for me, it was a kind of a circle that is closing as a chapter. So yes, it's all connected. Thank you, Camila.
Obrigado, Camila. Giorgio, vou fazer duas perguntas aqui para a gente encerrar. É, é possível
Absolutely, no problem.
pensar, é possível pensar que a não monogamia implicaria em libertar a experiência do amor de uma forma coletiva, como pensada de forma coletiva, datada por certas conjecturas simbólicas, e a não monogamia seria uma possibilidade de individuar a própria experiência de Eros, uma individuação de Eros, um amor que não tem um objeto específico, de um amor que. O amor pode se. Então tá, vou traduzir isso de uma outra maneira. Pode o amor se individuar? O que você acha?
Can love individuate? This is a very tricky question, Marcus. I don't know if I am able to reply to this, but what comes to my mind is that why, for example, I thought of non-monogamous relationship as a field to be explored in connection with individuation. Because in non-monogamy, if a person feels that it's possible to love more than one person at a time, it's definitely challenging norms and values that have been active for millennia. In non-monogamous jargon, there is a word that has been invented. It's already interesting that this word doesn't exist. It had to be invented. The word is compersion. Compersion is written in, I don't know how you can translate it in Portuguese. Leave it in English, compersion. It is the joy that you feel when your partner is feeling joy with another person. So it's the opposite of jealousy. Usually in monogamous relationship, but also in psychoanalytical theory, there is the idea that love is a limited quantity. It's a scenario of starvation economy. If you give love to that person, you are taking it away from me, as if it's a limited amount. It's either mine or the other person. Compersion is a new word invented in these communities to express the fact that you can be happy when the other is happy with another person. I think that this is really much subversive of the usual norms around what is ego love. So trying to do that, it seems to me a very big challenge. If a person has attachment, like anxious attachment style, it's very difficult to get to this kind of attitude. But anyway, isn't it an interesting topic, how to try to go beyond what is usually is thought to be the normal way to love a person? I love the person only when the person is with me, only if I am guaranteed that I'm the only one. Loving in that other way, like I love you when you are happy and I promote your happiness and you promote mine and I promote my happiness as well, could be a very challenging thing. Of course, also this could be taken by capitalistic mentality as doing whatever I want with no restrictions and with no, let's say, care for anybody in the picture. But this is not the ethos of people who are trying to be in this polyamorous arrangement. They try to have a very open dialogue with anyone in order that we agree on what we do. Everybody knows what's going on. Everybody has the right to say what they feel, if it's difficult for them or not. There's a lot of negotiation. It's totally the opposite of uncommitted relationship. It takes a huge effort instead to try to go with more than one person at a time. But they're trying to do that thing. I think this is a kind of individuation of the way we used to love. But I don't know if this is what he meant.
Só completando
Isso,
rapidinho,
isso
Marcos,
seria.
isso,
Vai,
posso?
vai.
É,
Claro.
quando a gente fala quando você fala de individuação na comunidade, será que a gente está falando disso? A gente chegar num sistema poliamoroso, derrubar a monogamia, seria uma individuação na comunidade?
No, I don't think so. In the community or co-individuation is to underline that it should be part of an individuation process that the whole community benefits of it, not only me. It's a very Western idea. The accent is on the individual, my own individuation process, and then maybe I don't care at all about what's going on around me. If I can say something maybe a bit provocative, this is part of the conversation with Shamdasani, because we were not agreeing on this. He said that Jung, in his opinion, was feeling himself individuated towards the end of his life. He thought of having gone through a lot of steps. As a result, Jung was not caring at all about people around him. He was very much self-content. I was telling to Shamdasani that, in my opinion, if you get to individuation, but you are an asshole with somebody else, in my opinion, you're not individuated. Said without bad words, the ethical aspect is important. I cannot claim just to be individuated for myself and then I behave badly with other people. I think that if there is an individuative growth, there should be an ethical outcome also in the way I treat the others. So Marcus before was talking about narcissism. I mean,
Giorgio, para a gente terminar, o que seria para você o fracasso da individuação?
well, using the words of Jung in the Red Book, you remember the spirit of the time and the spirit of the death. In my opinion, the failure of individuation is when the spirit of the time doesn't change. I mean that if this spirit is narcissistic, the spirit of the time is narcissistic, ego-centered, will to power. So until there are these things, in my opinion, the individuation has not yet happened. If I think of the political level, of how nations are managed, or how nationalism, also religion, identity, we are still binding the identity to a nation, to a religion, or all these things, in my opinion, are a failure of individuation. Like, it's not happening if we are still there to these things. And on the global level, unfortunately, it's not very encouraging what is going on. It seems to me that the spirit of the time is prevailing, and it's prevailing in a very negative way. That's why I hope that also we talk of individuation more. We try to understand more what is it about, because I think that individuation in this time has really something to do with improving also the world, and possibly transform something around us. This is why, Luciana, I think that it's also connected with ethics. It's not only my own process. It should be visible in something that we do also in our communities to make a better way of living, less waste, less pollution, less racism, less sexism. So if all these things are not changing, in my opinion, individuation is not going on. Of course, we have to start with ourselves, but as we are in communities, we should try to make this idea circulate in communities as well, that the spirit of the time needs to be transformed, because it's not going well, the world. Maybe
A gente poderia então pensar individuação como promessa, individuação como ética e individuação como ação no mundo, né? Acho que talvez a gente pudesse pegar essas três ideias e costurá-las
Very beautiful.
no projeto, né? Meu amigo, muito obrigado. Queria agradecer a tua presença aqui.
Thank you, thank
Para nós, para
Thank you.
mim, para Luciana,
I,
para Isa, você
thank you very much. I'm really happy that I could share for the first time with you these ideas, and I hope to see you again in the future. I wonder if some of you will go to Zurich next year. Maybe we meet in person there. I should be there.
A
Thank
gente
you.
queria te agradecer. Obrigado por você ter aceito o nosso convite.
Thank you.
Você entra no seleto hall dos
Thank you
convidados
to
que
you
vieram,
all. Have,
dos convidados que vieram 2 vezes ao teatro. Jorge, agora eu queria fazer a última pergunta. Posso
yeah,
fazer?
I'm
A
honored.
última.
I'm very honored.
Você ainda acha que o Arctic
Yes.
Monkeys é melhor que o Oasis?
Yes. Yes.
Sério? Tá
Thank
bom,
you.
tá
Thank you very
bom.
much. You are very, very nice people to me, and I really hope that we meet in person someday. Thank you.
Obrigado,
Have a nice
Jorge.
summer. All my envy from the Finnish winter. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, meu amigo.
Obrigado. Ciao.
Pessoal, obrigado pela presença. Tiaços está de volta. Voltamos com tudo, né, Luciana? E nos aguardem que ano que vem teremos novos convidados, novas dinâmicas, novas trocas. Vocês todos são muito, muito bem-vindos, tá? Se o Tiaços voltou, fundamentalmente é pela presença, demanda e carinho de vocês. Co-individuação. Estamos juntos, tá bom? Um beijo em todos.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.